20 Indian soldiers have fallen, killed in action, combating Chinese soldiers at the line of actual control. That's a top focus story. This is news that's just coming in. 20 braves of the Indian Army of the Bihar regiment, led by their commanding officer, Colonel Babu, they were killed in action. So the Chinese soldiers, we are told, they were to retreat from Patrol Point 14. That was the agreement at the level of commanders. The Chinese agreed, and then they stabbed India in the back.
Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom.
Everything was planned by Mao Zedong as early as 1949. Following the then recent victory of the Communist Revolution, Mao revived China's old imperial ambitions to impose its sovereignty on Tibet. He was not concerned by historical realities, or that the country had been governed for centuries by the Dalai Lamas. The first phase of the Maoist initiative was simple: to force the Tibetan authorities to admit that the Chinese forces marching upon their country were not an army of conquerors, but an army of liberation from Western imperialism. When the 17-point agreement was signed on May 17, 1951, Tibet lost Amdo, the Dalai Lama's native province, and Kham, which were both annexed by the Chinese. Reduced to its western portion, Tibet retained an autonomous government and its social and religious traditions. A minor concession for Mao, who'd obtained what he wanted. Tibet was declared liberated and not annexed, to show that it had always been Chinese. From this point on, any criticism of China's policy in Tibet would be condemned as interference in the internal politics of the country. The first phase of Mao's plan was complete.
Tezpur, in the northeast of India, has become known all over the world, for it was here that India received the Dalai Lama after his flight from Tibet. India offered the God King of Buddhism a safe refuge from the communist Chinese. To Tezpur flocked reporters representing the press of all the free world. By jeeps, the God King and his entourage traveled the last stage of their perilous 300-mile journey. Much less a pleasure trip was the Chinese Premier's visit to India, where government and people are very angry with China over border disputes. Nevertheless, there were no signs of disharmony at the Rajghat, where the visitor paid a tribute to the memory of Gandhi. At the Presidential Palace, former home of the Indian Viceroys, began the serious work of the visit. Dr. Prasad welcomed Cho on behalf of the Indian Republic. It has distressed India that friendship with China should have been strained. Hence, outside government circles, there's a strong anti-China movement, whose members make no bones about not welcoming Cho. There was a demonstration against China, and 55 people were arrested. Small wonder that at the residence of Premier Nehru, talks began in a rather difficult atmosphere. China seems to have gone out of her way, along her frontiers with India, and especially in Tibet, to humiliate Mr. Nehru. Yet even now, India strongly discouraged the anti-China movement. Two statesmen, in their different ways among the shrewdest in the world, were playing for high diplomatic stakes. In Panjim Harbour, the only sign of war was a sunken Indian fishing boat. Otherwise, the Portuguese had nothing to show. Their colony of Goa fell to the victorious Indian army like the flame of a taper blown out by a gentle breeze. There was rejoicing throughout India, consternation in Portugal, and righteous indignation in many countries. Panjim and the little colony of which it is the capital have been Portuguese for 450 years. When the British left India, Goa stuck out like a sore thumb. Now it is part of the Republic of India, after just about the easiest conquest on record. The Portuguese abandoned their arms, knowing they could not make any show against the 30,000 invading troops. The Governor-General's residence is now the headquarters of the Indian military governor, Major General Kande. At a press conference after the 36-hour war, he explained that the Indians came not as conquerors, but as protectors. India's patience had been exhausted. The Portuguese officers and men taken prisoner were told by a lieutenant colonel of the victorious army that they were now under Indian orders. A Portuguese officer passed on the information to the Luckress 4000 in captivity. Whether or not the Indian invasion was justified is being hotly debated. Meanwhile, Goa belongs to India. Brutally, peace-loving India has been awakened to the facts of communist aggression. Enraged mobs in New Delhi call down curses on Red China and her Premier Chow En-lai. Non-alignment, peaceful coexistence, neutrality have been exposed as a sham. China's invasion is completely unjustified, and every store owned by Chinese was attacked. Young Indians are enraged by the treachery of a neighboring country they had looked on as a friend. An effigy of Chow Enlai and Chinese shop signs made a bonfire together. The Western nations have come to India's aid with an airlift of war supplies. When the first anger of New Delhi's young men calms down, they will be free for a more practical war effort.
Tensions have been growing at the border as far as India and China is concerned after India's 20 jawans were martyred by the Chinese army, and protests have broken out, in different parts of the city where people are protesting against boycotting Chinese products. And we're here at one such protest in New Delhi where you can see that they're burning the Chinese products as per the protesters. And the idea behind this protest is to give the message that